Have you ever noticed that American presidents like to say America a lot?
And that's what America is all
Think
about.
about America within our reach.
Millions of Americans are out of work.
Has this always been the case, or is it a new trend? And what lies in store for the future of political rhetoric in the United States? To answer these questions, we've compiled 231 years worth of State of the Unions. Let's look at the data. These days, the State of the Union address is an annual event where the sitting President of the United States addresses a joint session of Congress. But it hasn't always been that way. It did start that way back in 1790 with George Washington, who did in fact address a joint session of Congress. But by the turn of the 19th century, when Thomas Jefferson came around, he decided that this was not the right way to proceed, and instead that it should be a written document that is then delivered to Congress. And this tradition actually held up for the entirety of the 19th century. It wasn't until 1913 with Woodrow Wilson where he decided to actually address Congress in person. And certainly breaking with a century-long tradition caused a bit of a stir. But then after that, it became a bit, ambiguous. Some State of the Unions were written, some were delivered in person. In 1923, President Calvin Coolidge gave the first State of the Union that was also broadcast on the radio and able to reach a wider audience than, the people in Congress. After that, we have Harry Truman, who after World War II was the first sitting president to actually give a State of the Union address that was broadcast on television, but it was a midday broadcast. In 1965, it was President Lyndon Johnson who gave a televised State of the Union that was broadcast in prime time or in the evening, so even more of the citizens were able to watch. And then that takes us all the way to 2002, where President George W. Bush was the first president to actually have a streaming webcast of his State of the Union, again able to reach an even wider, possibly global audience. So the State of the Unions are a fascinating corpus of documents and speeches, and luckily for all of us, they are available online via the American Presidency Project, which is run by Gerhard Peters and John T. Woolley at UC Santa Barbara. And it's an amazing resource, and I encourage you all to check it out yourself. There's a link down here in the description. So our dataset consists of 231 years worth of State of the Union documents and speeches. It was compiled via 43 of the 45 presidents because neither William Henry Harrison nor James A. Garfield survived long enough to give one. We also note that Grover Cleveland gets counted twice in this dataset. The entire corpus is over 1.75 million words long, with about half of them being speeches and half of them being written documents. So what we've done is taken all 231 years of State of the Unions and counted how many times in each one the word America or American has occurred in the written text. To see just how frequently America is used in the State of the Union, we'll compare it to the English alphabet. So in the English alphabet, not all letters are treated equally. In fact, the letter E is the most frequent in standard texts and documents, and it occurs about 11.2% of the time. In contrast, we have the least common letter, which is Z, or Z, depending on which side of the border you're on, and that occurs about 0.077% of the time. So to see just how frequently America occurs in these text documents, what we can do is treat it as the 27th letter of the alphabet, and then look to see just how frequently it actually occurs. So when we do that, we find that for the last 5 presidents, including also Richard Nixon, actually used more Americas than either Z, Q, X, J, or V. So there are 2 ways that we can look at this data. We can either treat it as just raw counts, that is, integers, Or we could consider frequencies. That is, we could take the total number of Americas and divide by the total number of words to get a frequency or a number between 0 and 1. And depending on which one we choose, we have two different ways we can model this. Both will fall into the category of the generalized linear model. For frequencies, we will use logistic regression, which we talked about very briefly in my previous video. If we want to look at raw counts or integers values, we can use the Poisson regression. So let's take a look at both of those. As discussed briefly in my previous video, logistic regression models the log of the odds ratio as a linear function. In this case, we'd be modeling the log of the odds as a linear function of the president's number. So as the president's number increases, how does that affect the frequency of America in the State of the Union addresses? So the odds, if you recall, is effectively the payoff for a fair bet. If the odds are 1 to 2, then if I wager $1, I should get 2 back if I win to make it a fair bet. In this case, we're effectively betting that if I were to choose a random word from a State of the Union address uniformly at random, that it would be the word America or American. So fitting such a model to the data, what we see is the odds of America are actually increasing at about 9% every successive president. How do we actually go about interpreting that? Well, let's take a look at economic theory. So if I were to, say, make an investment of $20 at a 9% interest rate, then we can do a quick calculation to find out that it would take about 8 years, assuming the interest rate is compounded annually, to double my investment to $40. Now, we can use this exact same idea and apply it to the odds of a president saying America. In this case, if the odds increases at a 9% rate, then what we find is that every 8 presidents, the frequency or the odds of America approximately double. In contrast to logistic regression, we could consider the Poisson regression. In this case, we're trying to model the log of the raw counts, the raw number of Americas, as a linear function. And we can do that. What we get is something that's going to look a bit more jagged, because now the role of the total word count is on the other side of the equation, and it's sort of playing a role behind the scenes. So it's not actually visible in this graph. But what happens is certain presidents are much more verbose than others, which leads to this jaggedness in the way that the graph looks. None more so than Teddy Roosevelt, who wrote, again, as a written State of the Union, more than 150,000 words over his 8 years. I'm not sure if he was trying to troll Congress before trolling was a thing, but it is sort of an interesting outlier when you look at just the total number of words in a State of the Union. Regardless of the fitted model, we still see an increase in the number of words at about 8.8% for every successive president. So we get a very similar number to what we did in the logistic regression. Fun side note, it actually makes sense that our logistic and our Poisson regression would be very similar. In the logistic regression, we're actually working with the binomial distribution. And in the Poisson, we're actually working with, well, the Poisson distribution. And if we go back to standard probability theory, what we find is that if we have a binomial distribution with a very small probability of a success and a very large number of trials, that is, a lot of words, but only a small chance that one of them is actually going to be America, we can actually approximate that distribution very closely by the Poisson. The Poisson distribution is used to model rare events, things like lightning strikes or radioactive decay. Let's look at outliers. Now that we have 2 different models for our State of the Union data, well, we can ask the question, are there any presidents who invoke America more frequently or less frequently than the rest, given their respective time periods? To do that, we can look at the residuals. A residual is really just the difference between what we observe and our fitted model. So the farther our data points are from our fitted model, the larger the residual and the more of an outlier that individual point is. Now, residuals for generalized linear models are actually kind of complicated. There's about 5 or 6 different versions that you can consider. We're not going to take the time to go into that now. Maybe it'll be something for a future video discussion. For now, we're just going to look very briefly at the idea of residuals as the difference between a fitted value and an observed value. So the biggest outliers in our data set are, in fact, Madison and Nixon, who actually invoke America much more frequently than other presidents in their respective time periods. On the other side, we have Truman, who did not say America as much as you might expect given his time period. When we look at our current and most recent president, Donald Trump, it might be interesting to note that he actually is not an outlier in the dataset. He does, in fact, invoke America more frequently than any previous president, but in line with the model as it is fit. So, all of those times when the news commentators decided to point out just how presidential he sounded in his State of the Unions, to a certain extent, they weren't wrong. Really not setting the bar too high, but they weren't wrong. He actually was sort of hitting the model, at least with respect to the number of Americas, right on the mark. So, good for him, I guess. Now, the models are actually quite interesting because while they seem to be very powerful tools, they're actually quite rigid. And it's one reason why people don't necessarily always like to use generalized linear models is that they're very rigid in the way they fit to the data compared to more, let's say, adaptable non-parametric methods. When we look at these models, we find a very interesting pattern. At the beginning, they actually underestimate the number of Americas. Then, in the middle of our data set, the presidents from about the Civil War to World War II, they overestimate. They think they're going to say America more than they do. And then come the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning now of the 21st century, we're actually still underestimating the number of Americas. So when we look at the residual plots and we try to smooth it out with a curve here, we see this behavior. And it's quite interesting. It says that currently the frequency of America might actually be increasing even faster than our model predicted. But the rigidity of the model is restricting just how fast it can predict. So in conclusion, we have now 2 different ways to analyze this data. If you're interested in trying it for yourself, the data and some R code is available on my website, linked down in the description. But it then leads to the question of what does the future hold for the State of the Union addresses? Well, if we actually are happy with extrapolating our model far into the future, it turns out that by POTUS number 53, we will actually have so many Americas to cross what I like to call the Langston-Hughes threshold of 2.35%. Now, the Langston-Hughes threshold is the frequency of America in his poem, Let America Be America Again, which is actually a shockingly relevant poem now 84 years after its publication, and perhaps worth a look. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about this analysis. Come February, whoever is giving the next State of the Union address, don't forget to look at the data.